Like many a folk, I loved running around Brinstar trying to find an extra missile upgrade or an E-tank. I drew my own maps on grid paper, and when I found out that people made maps online, I tried making my own routes. It was great, and honestly, you just had to be there. Fast forward a decade or two, and all of my wishes came true with consumer VR. For the same price as a console, we can play and even develop games. Even better, I can play Metroid in the headset.
Look at us. Look at us. Huh? Who would have thought? Not me.
Fast forward a few more years, and I've become just competent enough with 3D modeling and programming to feel like I'm able to make games for said VR. So follow me in recreating Metroid for VR. We'll be covering the basic mechanics I needed to make and furnish the world, trying to go for that classic isolated space bounty hunter feel that I fell so much in love with. Let's get started with the basics. I'm going to be using the Godot game engine with the XRTools made by the community. Shout out to Bastian and the rest of these amazing people that have made VR things such a breeze for Godot. This would not have been possible without them. Secondly, to speed things up, I'm going to go for a low poly, Minecrafty block bench vibe for the game. The reason for this is because I want to be able to run this on the standalone Quest headset. First, we're going to start with downloading and setting up the project with the latest OpenXR add-ons for Godot. First problem though, something somewhere wasn't working when I exported the exe. It just wasn't receiving the inputs from the meta controllers. Not wanting to bother the good folk that made the add-on for something I probably did wrong, I just cloned a template that I knew would work, and that seemed to do the trick. Now before I start anything, and because we're most probably going to be going from scene to scene, we're going to need an autoload. This is like global variables that I can refer to from anywhere in the game. So I add the basics, health, health max, missiles, and whether we're in the morph ball mode. I'm not going to place any upgrades in it and everything just yet, we'll just add on to it as we need it. Next up is the character movement, and to do that we just add the functions needed for this kind of player character. That'd be movement, turning, jumping. Lastly, I remove our right hand and in its place make a little preliminary blaster. Now this is usually the part where I get into making a body and arm mesh, but for the sake of speed and because there's literally a skin for everything in Minecraft, I'll just yoink a skin and use an old model I made in Blender from a previous project. Thank you so much, Prolium, for making this skin. You're truly a level 45 Master Hunter Wizard. After importing the model, hiding the arms and head, and making the materials for the Minecraft skin rip, I've chosen not to make things complicated for the legs like using IK. Instead, I made the body model play the walk animation when the player's left stick movement magnitude goes above a certain threshold, and play the idle animation when it's below that. Bada boom, we got walking legs. This is also how we get slow moving legs when the player is barely moving, I think. Next, we limit the minimum and maximum height for the player to set up the morph ball. Type in a bit of code, and now, when we get the input for the B button on the right hand, we hide the player model and change the height to a half or a third of the player's minimum and maximum heights. Also, we make it so the player can't shoot or jump while in morph ball mode. Last thing, we make it so that we can't unmorph when in a tight spot, so I went with adding a raycast that returns whether or not there's something solid above our heads. If there is, we are unable to morph back, and if there isn't, we go ahead with the unmorphin. Now for the blaster. I create a new node that spawns the bullet when the trigger input is pressed, and make it so that the bullet destroys itself after a set amount of time or collides with the world. For the missiles, since it's a VR game, instead of a controller button, I add a button on the cannon arm so when the player presses it, the missiles are enabled. Then I modify the shooting script to shoot missiles when it's toggled. Alrighty, now that we have the morph ball and missiles, we should probably make the upgrades to enable the things. First, I make a parent prefab with a script that is essentially all the power-ups. All I need to do is to set what power-up it will be through a drop-down in the editor, and then the game will set the right sprite and behavior when grabbed. Essentially though, all the upgrade prefab is doing is toggling the aforementioned autoloads variable. Next, we need a type of GUI that will show us the info. I placed it on the blaster arm, and it's updated through a method from the autoload mentioned earlier. This way it's only updated when a variable is changed and not all the time, which would drag down the computation power just for the UI. After testing that it all works, we do a little celebratory jig and we move on. Next up, and something I feel should be addressed ASAP when it comes to games, is making the lose condition of the game, i.e. death. We'll be making the lava prefab to hammer this out quickly. It'll be a simple 3D area trigger that enables when the player is in lava or not. Moving over to the lava script, we'll call the autoloads method to change the player's health when the player enters the delicious tomato soup. When they are, their health is decreased not too fast, but just enough. Once the player reaches 0 health, we hide the player graphics and start a timer that will switch to the game over scene, and then start another timer there to go back to the title screen. With death out of the way, it's time to make the enemies. First we'll start with the crawler zoomer. Bobby Evar's solution for his Metroid clone is more than enough, so I'll just do that. A raycast that, when collided with, turns the crawler to a random direction, and if the player is detected, it faces that way and charges to that player's location at this moment. Also, a side note on modeling the enemies, I want to make it a bit easier for myself when it comes to modeling and UV mapping the enemies by using an atlas texture, so all enemies use one. This also helps Godot by only having to draw one material instead of one for each enemy, as opposed to a dozen, which helps a ton for VR games. Next, we make the crawler defeatable by colliding with the player's lemons, add some health, and done. For the ceiling boy, we add a trigger area that when the player collides with, plays a telegraphing noise and after a delay, shoots down to the ground. When collided with the ground, a timer starts that when it's done, creates a handful of prefabs that can hurt the player. Hold on. And there. Make this boy be able to collide with bullets, add a bit of health, and boom, enemy done. Now that we have enemies, we need to make them occasionally drop health and missiles. In a similar fashion to the upgrade prefabs, we'll make a separate energy drop and missile drop prefab that has a 1 in 10 chance of dropping. Next up is for some secrets, and what more iconic than the bombable walls. One of the things that gave Metroid its infamous bomb every tile mantra. We'll just have to add the relevant autoload variables for the upgrade and make the bomb prefab to be spawned at the player's position when in morph ball mode. When the bomb's timer is up, we add a physics force that pushes the player up using Godot's built-in physics. And because we're using a character body 3D, we do that by simply adjusting its velocity by calculating the difference between the position of the player and the bomb, and change its velocity with an upwards and outwards force. Next, we make a bombable prefab that can be destroyed, and to test it all out, I made a quick tunnel, and check it out. Celebratory jig time. Now for another Metroid staple, shooting doors. I model a segmented door and then animate it in Godot to make things easy for myself. Then add a variable and timer for the door, and there we go. For the missile doors, I add a health variable that is toggled once the correct amount of missiles have been collided with it. And that's it. Now before we start building the world, one thing is left to do, a boss. First I model the chunky boy and give him a few variables to get him going. Luckily there's not a whole lot to him, as he's basically a damage sponge that shoots non-stop bullets. Oh, and moves back and forth. If you're curious, because I'm kinda proud of this, his movement basically uses delta, the time ticking thing for game engines, and uses it to move back and forth in relation to the player using math, specifically sine. I just remember as a kid always complaining about not using the advanced math IRL. Look at me now, should have listened to those old hats. Next, we make him defeatable. For the sake of this video, demo, clone, we'll transition to a game end screen that has the player stats like discovered secrets and gameplay time. After that, we transition the player to the title screen. With all the created systems, we now have all the needed items to make the small game. Now for my favorite part of game development, environment building and design. First, I'll make a few prefabs to decorate the world with, platforms, rocks, pipes, and the like. Then, a block out world that is stitched together with triggers that enable and disables the room scenes to not bog down the engine. After that, I punch holes for the rooms that'll have the doors separating the rooms. Something to keep in mind is where to add the upgrades so they act as gates for the player to get to the next ability gate/area, which all leads to the boss arena. This is, after all, a Metroidvania. At this point, I feel it's the right time for polishing up the models of the enemies, projectiles, and a cannon to make it fit the blockbench style better. The UV work is a little bit sloppy since the pixels of the textures aren't one-to-one with the world, or even themselves. And while I could have used Blockbench to do this, I'm just really not that great at using it. But it beats not having a texture for stuff. Another side note, and I'm not knocking on it, a lot of devs use a voxel look for their meshes, and while it's a really neat look, the amount of triangles and faces it uses is almost absurd to me. For example, this voxel model of Ridley on Sketchfab is about 6,000 triangles, and for comparison, all of Brinstar for my game is only 1,000. I'm not saying that the Quest headset wouldn't be able to handle voxel models or a game like that, I mean we've seen plenty, but in standalone VR it all adds up and could cause dropped frames leading to nausea. All this is really just to say that it's not good to be super sloppy, even if you can be. I think the most tedious part of was checking all the platforming sections to make sure that the jumps are even doable. And the way that jumping is handled within the XRTools is a bit more like Castlevania, where you're married to the jump arc. How once you press that button you better have calculated where you're about to land because you have no air control. So I edited the jumping code. The player can hop or long jump depending on whether they have the jump button held. Now it feels a little bit more Metroid and jumping is a bit more forgiving. Last, we add in some background music and any other sound effects, and as well as some juice, or I guess game juice, to the game. Some particles for the gun, change the app icon and splash screen, you know, just a bit of polish. And now I do believe it's time for our final celebratory jig. And with this we have a semi-fleshed out Metroid clone in VR. Obviously I can't finish and release this without having Nintendo sue me into oblivion, so I was thinking of adapting all this into its own game with a setting like Blame. Think there might be something there? Anyway, if you liked the video, give it a like, drop a comment on how terrible my code is, or whatever. I'm currently unemployed and would love some money, or better yet a job. So if you had fun watching this or playing this, consider donating on my itch.io, where the playable build for PC VR and the Meta Quest is at. Maybe throw me a coffee, whatever you want. You're the one with free will. Until next time.